from Oxford, and her talk will be on the norm of assertion.
The social norm of assertion.
The social norm of assertion. Good.
Am I on? Thank you. Probably best to clap before the talk, because afterwards you may, first of all, am I kind of the right volume? Is this okay? People can hear me. Okay. So first, thanks so much to John and to Eleonora for inviting me to visit the project and to the conference. I'm already having a really great time. It's great to be here. Thanks. Thank you so much. And to all the other people who've been helping with arrangements, etc. Okay, so this is not going to be nearly as swish as Peter's presentation. This is just a Word document, and I'm going to be scrolling it down, and it may disappear if I forget to click my thing and all that kind of stuff. But what you're going to see on the screen is the same as the handout. It has all the sort of main points, and there's some more. I mean, so when you look over afterwards, it gives you the main arguments, but not all the filling in. I think I'm going to have to wear my glasses. Maybe I don't. Okay, I'm going to try without my glasses. Okay, so I know I'm the third and last speaker of the day, so I hope this talk is quite fun. I had fun writing it, and I'm going to talk about various kinds of games, which I hope will be actual games, like what you call soccer and what I'm calling competitive ice dance. So, okay, so before writing this, I reread Peter's great paper on social norms that's coming out in the Epistemic Evaluations volume, edited by David Henderson and John Greco. I'd read it a year ago, but I reread it, and he says in that paper that he thinks that epistemic norms are social norms. They may be other kinds of norms as well, but he argues that at least they're social norms. So I wanted to think, that set me thinking about could something be a social norm and be another kind of norm as well? And that's what this is about. And the punchline I get to at the end is what I'm interested in, the norm of assertion. And I lay out some considerations in the paper, which I hope shows how it can be the case that the norm of assertion can both be a constitutive norm of an abstract speech act type and also be a social norm governing the practice of making assertions. But I lay out some things about different kinds of norms governing games, which I think helps us see how that can be the case. I hope I'm going to get through this in an hour. I'll do my best anyway. I think, as I said, I think the material isn't very difficult. Okay, to start off with, so I'm interested in this question: could there be a norm governing the speech act of assertion, which is both a social norm and a constitutive norm of assertion? And my answer is going to be yes, but I'm going to spell out why I think there's a prima facie tension here. But then I'm going to show that it's, I think, possible and plausibly true. So I'm going to end up proposing that the speech act type assertion is governed by a norm that's constitutive of the act type. We can represent that schematically as one must assert P only if phi of P, where phi is some property or other to fill in with your favored constitutive norm for assertion. So that's true of the speech act type, but it's also the case, the second thing, that a community C has this type of speech act assertion, which I represent the type by spelling it in capitals, has the type assertion in its repertoire of ongoing speech act types that are available to be made in this community, just if the constitutive norm for assertion, the speech act type, is a social norm in that community. So that is supposing that the constitutive norm of assertion is one must assert P only if S of P, where S is some specific condition. Then it's a social norm in C that one must assert P only if S of P. I do have a view about what the specific norm of assertion is, but that's, I mean, the argument I'm giving in this paper doesn't require a view about that. Okay, so first I'm going to give a quick definition of a social norm, which is basically the version that Peter gives in his paper, which is essentially derived from Pettit. So roughly speaking, a social norm in a community is a regularity in behavior. Whoops, I'm just going to, why does it keep doing this? I never know why it does this. That's what I need to do. So social norm in a community is a regularity in behavior in the community, which is accompanied by prescriptive sanctions. attitudes of disapproval and other sanctions, and praising of conformity. And where, third condition, the persistence of this regularity is causally explained by the existence of these prescriptive sanctions. So more exactly we can define it, and this is what you've got up here, that there exists a social norm in community C that when in situation S, one should do F, just if first condition SN1, there is in C a regularity R in behavior to which individuals of C extensionally conform. The irregularity, we'll call it R, is when in S do action F. So there is the regularity. Second condition, SN2, that the regularity R is surrounded by prescriptive sanctions, attitudes of disapproval, plus other sanctions to violations and approval, etc., of conformity. And then thirdly, SN3, that the persistence of R in C is causally explained by the second condition, the existence of the prescriptive sanctions. So that's roughly the Pettit definition which Peter endorses in the paper I'm referring to. Okay, has to go away. Okay, so the first point I want to make about this, which Peter did mention in passing this morning, but it wasn't really highlighted. So the regularity in behavior consists in, sorry, I didn't say that again. Okay, so notice that these attitudes are in the first instance attitudes to instances of violations. So I have this idea that normally you shouldn't go to the clubhouse without a jacket and tie. So someone comes in without a tie on and people react. What's he doing in here without a tie on? We won't talk to him, how disgraceful, let's move away. So these attitudes are to instances of violation, okay, and maybe also attitudes of approval to instances of conformity to the regularity. So the first point I'd like to make is that knowledge of the universal precept, the expression of the regularity, doesn't have to be explicit, it could just be tacit knowledge. Just to repeat that point, the sanctioning attitudes that reinforce and maintain in existence the regularity are, in the first instance, reactions to instances of violation. That's all the definition I just gave requires, and it's surely all that's needed for the intuitive idea we're seeking to articulate. Now, it may be that in some case, maybe many cases of social norms, there is in fact explicit representation by participants, I'll call them participants, of the universal rule that expresses the norm. So when in the clubhouse, one should wear a jacket and tie. One should say thank you when given a present, and so forth. And it may be that in these cases where there is explicit representation and knowledge of the norm, that the propagation of the norm in such cases is partly affected by explicit teaching of and reference to the universal precept as a norm. But it's familiar from other areas of philosophical and cognitive research in human cognition and capacities, including social capacities, that there's a common phenomenon that many kinds of intelligent human activities are informed and regulated by universal generalizations or precepts that are not an item of explicit representation and knowledge by participants. So, for example, the rough generalizations of folk psychology, if you look at the way in which we explain and predict others' actions and our understanding of our own actions and behavior, it seems very clear that we have a tacit grasp of various platitudes of folk psychology. One of the most obvious ones is the schema of rational action. So if someone wants that P and believes that by phi they can bring about P, then they're like other things being equal, they're likely to phi. It's clear that we understand and predict and explain others' behavior by instances of that schema of rational action the whole time. But most ordinary folk who aren't professional philosophers or psychologists have never explicitly articulated that platitude. So the phenomenon, the point I'm making is the phenomenon of tacit knowledge of a universal precept somehow informing and guiding behavior is a well-known phenomenon that we clearly have to postulate. I never know how to stop this doing this. Okay. So it shouldn't be controversial that I'm saying we have a case of this well-known phenomenon with social norms, that often the cognitive relation to the social norm in the community is that there's only tacit knowledge of the formulation of the norm as a universal rule. And this is the bit summarizing what I've just been saying that I've got here. So I suggest we should articulate the idea of a social norm. So it's not required that participants explicitly represent and state and teach to each other the universal precept. It's enough that they respond to instances of violation by others with disapproval and other sanctions, and to instances of conformity with approval and other forms of positive reinforcement. So we have those responses to instances, and we posit that these responses to instances are explained by tacit knowledge of the norm. And that individuals' own actions equally are seen to be guided by tacit awareness of the norm. That's that they have a tendency to avoid violations, and if they do violate, a tendency to expect, to feel guilty, to expect sanctions from others, and so forth. And if these phenomena all occur, this, I suggest, shows that tacit knowledge of the universal precept is guiding individuals' responses to instances. And notice also that we can explain how the norm is propagated without explicit representation and passing on of the universal precept. Individuals who are sanctioned or praised for individual particular violations and conformity are going to extrapolate, as long as individuals, participants in the practice have, as it were, relevantly similar similarity spaces, they're going to make the same extrapolations from instances, and so the norm can get propagated. Okay, so the point that the norm is only tacit is quite important for the case that I ultimately am interested in, which is the norm of assertion, because given that knowledge of the universal formulation of the norm only needs to be tacit, it doesn't follow from how we've defined a social norm that when there exists a certain social norm, N, in the community C, that everyone in the community they won't have, we just said they don't have to have explicit personal level knowledge that this is the norm. And consequently, the fact that the social norm does, as it were, obtain in a community where it's the correct formulation of what guides practice doesn't mean that everybody is going to know that that's the norm. It could be that although they're conforming to the norm, as it were, disputes can break out about what exactly the content of the norm is. And I think that's the case. That explains why philosophers can be arguing about what the norm of assertion is. Even if it is a social norm, it doesn't follow that we all know what norm that is. So explicit precepts like you should say thank you when you're given a present are not the only kind of case. And I think a lot of the social norms are going to be tacit in the way I've explained. Okay, so that's the first point I wanted to make. Now, I said I was interested in the question, say Peter said something can be a social norm and be a norm of another kind. So I'm going to look at what other kinds of, let's say a regularity can both be a social norm in a community and also simultaneously be a norm of some other kind in that community. So I'm just going to look at some cases of that. Firstly, what about convention? I'm going to show you how regularity can both be conventional in a community and also be the subject of a social norm in that community. So following Lewis's, I don't know why it's doing this, sorry, go away. Go away. Okay, so roughly, this isn't exactly Lewis's definition of convention. It's because I don't have all the stuff about mutual knowledge. But roughly speaking, Lewis says that there exists a convention in a community C that when in situation S, one should do F, just if, firstly, call this CV1, there's a regularity R in behavior in C that individuals, when in S, do action F. And notice that clause is the same for my def by clause for a social norm. And secondly, we have that CV2, the individual preferences are such that each member of C has a self-interested reason to conform to R, given that she believes that all or nearly all other members of C conform to R. And thirdly, that this fact, that each person has a conditional preference for conformity, is what causally explains the persistence of the regularity R in C. Okay, so we've got the definition of a social norm, the definition of convention. The first clause about the regularity is the same, but then the explanation of why the regularity persists is different. So it looks as if something can't be both a social norm and a convention. And it certainly is the case that a convention solves a coordination problem, as it were. So it's just we need to, everyone's interested in conforming, we just need to fix on one of the various arbitrary possibilities to conform to. Whereas a social norm typically is needed when we have what Bikiri calls a mixed motive payoff matrix. So even when you know other people are conforming, it's sometimes in your interest to not conform. So like a free rider problem is a case where you need a social norm. So it looks as if, as it were, conventions versus social norms just have different underlying payoff matrix situations. So something, you can't have a situation where you have both. So with a convention, individual preferences, as you can spell out in a payoff matrix, are such that it's in each person's rational self-interest to conform, so long as she knows that nearly everyone else conforms. So, for example, which side of the road to drive on. I mean, it doesn't really matter a damn to me which side of the road I'm driving on as long as I'm doing the same as everybody else. I mean, we're all driving on our own left, or we're all driving on our own right. So it looks like you don't need a social norm to enforce that. And we don't need sanctioning attitudes because everyone's got an interest to do it anyway. But not so fast. Okay, so this detail isn't on the handout, so just listen to what I'm saying. Okay, so consider my case of you must wear a jacket and tie when going into the clubhouse at a golf course. So maybe golf club members are all conformists. So each one has, in any case, a self-interested reason to dress similarly to all the other members. So if they know everyone else wears a jacket and tie, they want to do that anyway. So it looks as if there'll be a convention to that effect. But the motive of wanting to conform to the standard style of dress everyone else has only gives you a prima facie reason to act. It could be trumped in particular cases. So suppose that one day George has driven the long drive to the golf club to meet a colleague for lunch, but he's forgotten his tie that he planned to put on when he arrived. So the coordinating motive is his preference for conformity in dress with other members would have to be very strong to motivate him to drive all the way home or to buy one of the expensive and hideous club ties to wear. So his preference for dressing the same as others isn't strong enough to get him to do so in this case. But suppose there's also a strong social norm amongst club members in favor of the regularity that you must always wear a tie. He'd incur vehement disapproval if he enters and has lunch without a tie on. So this additional sanctioning of disapproval that a social norm surrounding this regularity provides can give him the extra spur to bother to use up his money on the hideous club tie. So the conclusion I draw here is that if we interpret the idea of causally explains in the third clause of the definition of a social norm, a convention, interpret that weakly is a causally explanatory factor, then we can say that something can be both a convention and a social norm. So the preference for conformity can give you one motive to conform, but a social norm, as it were, enforcing conformity, give extra motives on top of it. And I make the empirical, I wish this thing would go away. Good idea. Can I turn that? I think if I actually accept it, it should then go away.
Go back to your...
I think if I just accept, it will go away then. I can turn my Wi-Fi off up here. Turn Wi-Fi. Okay, good. Thank you.
Do you want me to advance it for you? Or are you okay?
No, I can. Oh, no, I'll do that. Thank you. The thing is, So as long as we interpret the explanatory clause in the definitions weakly, a regularity in a community can both be a convention and also a social norm. And more broadly, it can be a social norm and a norm of some other kind. That's to say, with some other enforcing mechanism. So, in particular, there's no reason why a social norm in a community can't also be a moral norm. So just that was, again, that's spelling out the idea that Peter had in the paper I'm referring to. So we've seen that irregularity can be reinforced both by the self-instructed conditional preferences characteristic of a convention, but also the further reinforcement of a social norm. But also a social norm could enforce a moral norm. I think all this stuff. Yeah, okay, so this isn't on the handout. So nothing to look at. So some social norms are just that. They prescribe or proscribe a type of behavior which, without the existence of the norm, there'd be no normative reason for anyone to go in for or avoid. Actually, I think this is here. Let me have a look. No, I've lost it. Okay, I'm just going to do without this bit. Okay, so some social norms, like etiquette, norms of etiquette, there's absolutely no reason why you should wear a bow tie unless everybody wears a bow tie and it's enforced. But some way to behave when in S2F might also be a moral norm. That's to say, it might be a way to behave that's required by moral standards and also, fortunately, be a social norm. And given human moral weakness and lack of suitable moral education or training, moral standards, I suggest, are going to be conformed to much more widespreadly in consistency if transgression is socially sanctioned. If it's a social norm as well as an objective moral requirement so to act. Individuals' conformity to a moral standard may be motivated both by knowledge that breaking it would be wrong and by wanting not to be disapproved of, etc. So if anyone has to teach Mill's utilitarianism to first years, his account of the sanctions of morality there is exactly right. You've got the internal and the external sanctions and the internal sanctions. The internal sanction of conscience, but also not wanting to be disapproved of, punished, etc. So it could be that the main factor causing conformity to right action and avoidance of wrong action in the community is the desire to avoid the sanctions of breaking a social norm. Little work is done by knowledge of moral requirements plus individual conscience. Okay, so I'm going to move on, skip a bit. How am I doing time-wise? I'm about halfway through my time. A bit less, actually, because I started late, right? Okay, good. Okay, so we've seen it's not really too difficult to explain how a social norm can also be a convention and a moral norm. It's a more tricky question to answer. Can a regularity in behavior in some community be both a social norm in that community, and also a constitutive norm or rule of some activity? Okay, and so most of the substance of what I'm doing today is trying to untangle how this is possible. Okay, so let's distinguish between what I'll call constitutive features versus constitutive norms. So it's a constitutive feature of jumping that one's body leaves the ground. If one bends one's knees and just bounces up a bit, but one doesn't leave the ground, one hasn't jumped. It's not that one's made a bad jump, one just hasn't jumped at all. So this just seems obviously right. A feature which is definitional of an activity such that if it's not fulfilled, the activity hasn't occurred, can't be the subject of a social norm governing the performance of that activity. So there can't be a social norm when jumping one should leave the ground. The fact that when anyone jumps they leave the ground is not a contingent regularity in behavior, but a definitional truth. So this pseudo-rule, when jumping one should leave the ground, can't be violated. A fortiori, it can't be that its violations are standardly sanctioned. Notice, of course, there could be, I said so, if you jump, you leave the ground by definition. There could be a different social norm which jumping featured in, like, so maybe the norm is when you greet the emperor, you're supposed to jump. And then if you just do this, but you don't actually leave the ground, you violated the norm. So that would be a different thing where there could be a social norm, but there can't be a social norm about jumping as such. Okay, so constitutive features can't be subjects of a social norm because they can't be violated. But what we might call constitutive rules of games or kinds of activities are not all constitutive features. Some of them are constitutive norms, which are... Okay, so the performance norms of competitive ice dance. And by competitive ice dance, I mean the kind of thing you see on the TV when they have the skating at the Olympics. Does everyone know the kind of thing I mean? So like, they do all these jumps and turns, etc. And the one who gets the highest scores from the judges gets the gold. And there are many tears and cries of joy and woe. Okay, is this loud enough? Can people hear me? Can we turn it up a bit? Does this turn it up? Is that louder? Okay, is that, okay, good, right. Okay, so an intentional activity, especially if it involves more than one person, can have, as well as constitutive features, constitutive norms. These are norms, and this is all on this, because this is the core of what I want to say, really, so I put it all on the handout and on the screen. So these are norms governing how the activity is supposed to be done, but the features prescribed in the norm are not definitional of the activity. It can be done without fulfilling them. Nevertheless, that these norms apply to the activity that these norms apply to the activity is part of what the activity is. So a participant not sensitive to them, not trying to conform to them, would not really be engaged in the activity. So that's the general idea. And my example is what I'm calling competitive ice dance. So this is a highly regulated competitive activity. Its practice is partly constituted by various norms as to what constitutes, for instance, executing like a triple turn well. And just listen to the commentaries of the judges. She did that perfectly, she kept her shoulders straight or whatever. These kind of features you're supposed to have, which are completely inessential, as it were, but they're just norms of how you're supposed to do it. So these norms of good performance are internal to the institution of competitive ice dance. They're certainly deeply entrenched as standards in the actual institution, to the extent that one may say they're constitutive performance norms of this competitive activity. Okay. So just to repeat, you're not really engaging as a participant in competitive ice dance. You may be on the rink at the Olympics, but unless you take these norms seriously, unless you're trying to conform to them in your performance, you're not really engaging in the competitive activity. Nonetheless, clearly there can be ice dice performances that fail to conform to these performance norms. They're ideals, hard to realize, that's the point. There may also be some other constitutive norms of the performance, like, say, bowing to the judges at the end, which are so easy to achieve that attempts to conform to them will almost always be successful. In these cases, non-conformity will almost always be motivated rather than the result of failure. And in this case, with competitive ice dance, presume if you're in it, you want to win, so there isn't any obvious motive for violating a norm. But we're going to see other kinds of case where there is a motive for violating the norm, which is what I'll come onto in a bit. So, generalizing from this example, we can conclude that the constitutive performance norms of an activity with such performance norms can be violated. So I'm just repeating what I've already said, but someone's not engaged in the activity if they're not to some significant degree making efforts to conform to the performance norms. Because they could be going through the motions, but this is only a pretense or fake, it's not sincere. So if you're on the ice, but you're not really trying to do the jumps well, and the only reason you're there is because you're in a Hitchcock movie, and this is the only way that you can keep safe from your murderer at the moment, is to be out there pretending to perform. You're not really competing. Okay, so I hope you agree that there are these norms which are internal to the activity and constitutive of it. And, as it were, they're only norms within the activity. They have no absolute, as it were, rationale. Just think of another case. So, remember reading or hearing something about a marmalade making competition? And they have these people who taste all these marmalades and have these ridiculous standards like the pot must be absolutely full, things like this. And who cares? But they just have introduced these standards. Okay, so Are these, so I've said there are these constitutive performance norms of ice dance and other similar activities. Are these social norms? They're constitutive norms. Are they social norms? Well, they're not exactly social norms, but I think there's something very much akin within, as it were, within the competitive activity. So the regularities in how your ice dance performance should be done, which these norms mandate, are certainly maintained on instances of performance through approval and reward of success in conformity and punishment by failure and low estimation of non-conformity. So there is these sanctioning attitudes, but it's not exactly moral disapproval, but it's a sui generis, as it were, approval and disapproval within the competitive activity. So let's call these the judges' norms. So the judges, the ones who hold up the cards, 6, 7, 8, 10, whatever. So they're the judges' norms, and these norms of evaluating the performance are in play in a competition just if, so we've got a particular event. We've got a particular event, we've got the constitutive norms of ice dance. Are they in play in a particular occasion? Well, they are just if there are judges and they're applying them in their approvals and sanctionings. And the audience, the judges, are applying these standards and approving and sanctioning with high and low marks. And it may or may not also be the case that the audience watching, the spectators, are exemplifying these attitudes to a greater or lesser degree. And the competitor is genuinely engaging in the activity only if her performance is aptly sensitive to some degree to these norms. She's seeking to conform to them and succeeding at least to some significant degree. So from this example, I've got two conclusions. So I can't manage to do what I'm trying to do, never mind. Okay, so just concluding from that example. So first conclusion, that these performance norms are constitutive of a certain type of activity, which we'll call ice dance by Olympic standards, because of course you could have somewhat different standards in other nearby possible worlds. And the fact that they're constitutive of this type of activity means that, firstly, someone's intentionally engaging in the activity only if she's aptly sensitive to these norms in her performance. And also there have to be critics evaluating her performance with regard to these norms. But, crucially, it's not the case that a performer always succeeds in conforming to these constitutive performance norms. So that's the first thing. So that's the thing about what the type is. And the second thing is, if there's something going on somewhere on an ice rink, there's a practice of ice dance by Olympic standards going on this ice rink, just if there is an activity in which these norms of ice dance are being applied by judges and the participants are trying to conform to them. So we've got a type defined by constitutive norms, and then we've got what it takes for something going on somewhere at a particular time to be instancing that type of activity. So, and that's the sort of general idea I want to export to think about what's happening with, as it were, the abstract type assertion and the practice of making assertions in a community. So thinking about ice dance has given a model which is applicable with some minor variation to the case of assertions. So it's a constitutive norm, it's constitutive activity that you're trying to conform to the norm, but there can be instances of the activity where the participant fails to actually conform to the norm. In the case of ice dance, this is going to be because the norms are difficult to fulfill. It's really difficult to do a triple jump, and land without, wobbling at all or whatever. So we've got that it's a constitutive norm, but it's contingent, as it were, and in fact it's not whether the norms are fulfilled in a given instance, and in fact they're not always fulfilled. What we don't have yet with this analogy is a motive for violation of the norms governing the activity. ice dance participants fail sometimes to fulfill the performance norms because they're hard to achieve. But in contrast with assertions, people may sometimes assert something that isn't true by mistake, but they also may do it intentionally with a motive to lie. So we have to see if we can find a model to explain how there can be a constitutive norm governing an activity, and yet there can be people who are genuinely engaged in the activity, sensitive to the norm, and yet have a motive to violate it. So we move on to soccer, or football as I shall now call it. Okay, so okay, I'm not doing too badly, okay. So we saw that, just to recap, we saw that constitutive features of an activity, like in jumping you leave the ground, can't be the content of a social norm, since by definition, someone can't be participating in the activity in some instance, and yet this feature failed to be fulfilled, so there's nothing for the norm to be about. In contrast, as we saw with ice dance, with the constitutive performance norms of an activity, it's constitutive that I'm just recapping what we've established, okay? It's constitutive that the performer's activity is to some degree aptly sensitive to the norms, but this is consistent with her failing perfectly to fulfill the norms in her performance, because they're difficult to fulfill. So this means that it's contingent whether an instance of the activity fulfills the norms or not, and so the scope for the existence of attitudes surrounding instances of the activity that reward success and sanction failure in conformity to these performance norms of the activity. So just to repeat, we have, with the performance norms of ice dance, we have a model for how a norm can be both constitutive of some activity and yet it be contingent that instances of the activity fulfill the norms. So there can be a practice of approval/disapproval surrounding the regularity and transgressions of the regularity. Something like a social norm. What we don't yet have is a model for a regularity where there's a motive to violate the norm. Okay, so now what about rules of a game? Many games, if not all, so I haven't yet got to the handout either, so I'll tell you when I get back to here. Many games, if not all, have constitutive rules of the game found in the rule book. For instance, in writing this paper, I looked up rules of football and I found the Football Association's rules of football stated on their website. There aren't very many, not nearly as many as cricket. So for instance, there are rules about what moves are permissible for each piece in chess. And in football, there are rules, for example, well, there's a rule that you mustn't handle the ball, apart from the goalkeeper, and that you mustn't, quote, use excessive force. So you mustn't kick or bite another player or assault them generally. And there's the offside rule, and people who don't know what the offside rule is can ask Peter afterwards. So what do we say about these constitutive rules of a competitive game? Well, I was puzzled about these. So the rules of a game seem to be a puzzling halfway between constitutive features versus constitutive norms. Now, I'll actually suggest shortly that some game rules are pretty much like constitutive features, whereas others are like they are constitutive norms. So, what's the relation between the rules of a game? Like, if we think of football, we've got the rules of football on the FA website. I'm sure the rules of chess are written in lots of places. Some games may just be played and there aren't any official statements of the rules, but chess there is. So a theoretical purist might insist that, strictly speaking, an occasion on which something occurs which is purportedly a playing of chess, but in which a piece's move rule is violated once, strictly speaking, isn't a game of chess. But this view is a mistake. This view mistakenly fails to acknowledge that there's a degree of slack between the definition of a game in the rule book for it and the practice of playing it. So, for example, in the chess game, somebody might secretly cheat in chess. They might move their piece while the other player is looking, and if it's a very, very low-level game, the other player might not notice they've done that. So a cheat occurred, so it's strictly, but it would be absurd to say it wasn't a game of chess. It's just a game of chess in which someone cheated. Similarly regards other games, for example, a game of football in which there's an undetected foul by a player. So, generalizing from these two examples, it seems that the rules of a game G define the game G qua type. But notwithstanding this, some individual playings may conform to the rules of G sufficiently to count as playing of the game G, despite the fact that some players have broken the rules of G, sometimes during the playing. And we'll explore in a minute why this makes sense. So, why would players break the rules? The most interesting reason for this is that players break the rules because they want to win, and some of the rules make it harder to win. So there's a game-related motive to break them. This is the main reason why it makes sense to think of players as still playing the game, despite their just cheating violation of the rules. So in football, fouls and offsides, when detected, are penalized by the referee as part of the rules of the game. So if you're detected in a foul, the other side gets a free kick or penalty kick or something. And that's a pretty big advantage. So that gives quite a big reason to try not to do a foul. So there's a penalty, as it were, prescribed within the game. In addition, it might be that there are sanctioning attitudes to violations of the rules exhibited by other players and by the spectators of the game. There's certainly going to be sanctioning of the kind of things football players do when they bite another player, for example. So within the rules of football prescribe penalties for violations of the rules, don't use excessive force, don't handle the ball. But in addition, there may be what amounts to a social norm, attitudes of the spectators and the other players, which further enforces the conformity to these rules. So in that case, we seem to have a constitutive rule of the game, plus it's being enforced by a social norm sanctioning violations of that rule. So it seems to be true of many games, both that the rules define the game, and also there's a social norm within the practice reinforcing conformity to the rules. Now, of course, the social norm enforcing conformity to the rules could be just a general one, good chaps don't cheat in games, as it were, or it could be specific to a particular game. But as in other cases, a social norm gives a further reinforcement of something which is sanctioned already in other ways. Okay, but how can these two things be true about games? That the rules define the game, but also there's a social norm reinforcing conformity to the rules. How does this make sense? If the rules define the game, then surely, as with jumping, it's just a logical impossibility that a playing of the game occur, although the rules are violated. So how can you have a constitutive rule enforced by a social norm? This is the thing I was originally puzzling about. Well, this makes sense if there's both a gap and a relation between the defining rules RG of a game. So this is my proposal about the relation between the rules of a game and what it is for some activity on some particular day to be a playing of that game. So a playing is of game G with defining rules R of G, just if, firstly, all the players, not just if this is a sufficient condition, I'm not saying it's a necessary condition, necessary condition probably weaker. So it is if, firstly, all the players are aware of all the rules of the game as such. Secondly, all the players are aware that playings of G should conform to the rules of G, that's to say these rules are of G. And thirdly, all the players take the current playing to be of G. And fourthly, the overarching intention of each player is to be participating in the game G. And fifthly, all the players conform most of the time to the rules of G. And sixthly, if a player knowingly transgresses the rules R of G, she's aware that this is a transgression and aware that if discovered, her transgression will attract penalties for such transgression specified in the rules. So in football, if you do a foul, and the referee sees you, the other side gets a free kick or a penalty if it's in a certain area, which is pretty bad. So there's the penalties within the rules of the game. If, in addition, the game's being played in circumstances with the spectators who have a social norm of, against cheating in games, then each player will know also that if she breaks a rule and she's detected, she'll be disapproved of by other players, etc. So that to me seems to be sufficient for a playing to be a playing of G. And it doesn't mean that the rules have to be conformed to perfectly all the time. What matters is that players are aware of the rules and aware that if they transgress, they'll be sanctioned. If, in contrast, players in a token playing event, call it E, are not seriously attempting to conform to the rules of G, and violations of the rules of G are not regarded as transgressions, then actually E can't be a playing of G at all. So, for example, if players in a game with a ball start to pick it up and run with it, and no one complains and tries to stop them, and the referee doesn't blow the whistle, but instead they all start doing it too, then they're no longer playing soccer, but instead they've invented the game of rugby football. Which is apparently what happened. Okay, so I'm getting near the end. This is like one of Donald Davison's papers in the respect that the thing goes on for ages and then the whole argument is like 2 sentences at the end. So, okay, so I think rules of a game, with some idealization, can be split into 2 types. There are rules that are genuinely constitutive features of G, such that if they're not conformed to, it's not a playing of G. So, if it wasn't, people kicking a ball, trying to get it into the other person's goal and stop it getting to your own goal, it wouldn't be football. I think the thing is a constitutive of basically when you buy a new game and you get these rules, so it's object of the game. I think object of the game is going to be constitutive. If it doesn't have that object, it doesn't make sense to think it's that game. So there are the constitutive features, and when you see the rules of the game, they're all just written as rules, but I think they fall into these 2 types, as I say, with some idealization. So there are other rules of the game that aren't constitutive features of what the game is. They're rather rules about how the game should be played, but they can be violated in the playing consistently with that playing still being a playing of the game in question. So these second kind, they're not constitutive features, they're rather constitutive norms, like the constitutive norms of Eystanz. So it's essential to what the activity is that you ought to conform to these rules, but sometimes people don't. So these are constitutive norms rather than constitutive features. They're norms because they lay down how one should play. They're constitutive because they're constitutive of that game, because it's only true that this is how one should play the game, because that's what the rule stipulates. And yeah, so rules of the constitutive features are the ground rules of the game that specify what play broadly consists in and what constitutes winning, okay? The constitutive norms are typically constraints on what means is permissible within the rules to achieve the, quotes, object of the game, to win. So because they're constraints on what means are permissible to achieve the objective, they lay down how one should play, and this is why they can be violated while it still makes sense to judge that the game is being played. And this is why there's a motive on the part of players to violate the rules. So the rules constrain what you're allowed to do to achieve the objective. So if what you really want to do is win, you'll have a motive to try and cheat while no one's looking. So such constraints on how one may permissibly within the rules of the game seek to win are imposed often to make the game a better game, to make it more fun, more entertaining, safer or such like. And this is actually explicit in this statement of the offside rule in the FA rules of football. So the offside rule says that you're not allowed to pass the ball to a player on your side when there is no defender between him and the goal. Because if you didn't have that, you could just kick it to him, he'd kick it in the goal, and the game wouldn't be very interesting because people just win goals all the time. So here's another example of a game which I played as in my childhood and features in the film Charade with Cary Grant and Audrey Hepburn, where you have a grapefruit under your chin. So you have a line of people and you have to pass the grapefruit down the line, but you're not allowed to use your hands, you just have to have it under your chin. So the restriction on how you achieve the objective makes the game, okay? You're not allowed to touch it with your hands. But of course, supposing you actually were some poor Italian extra in this game, and you had very little money and there was a cash prize, you'd have a motive to try and secretly sort of nudge it with your hands if that was going to help. Okay, so generalizing from what I've said about football, etc., I'm going to draw these conclusions. So it can be, there's a certain rule, Ri, is a constitutive norm governing a certain type of intentional activity, call it I. That is, it's part of what I is that one ought to conform to this rule when engaging in I. And one main reason that's happened is when you have a game where there are explicit rules that just say, this is what you're supposed to do. Consistently with this fact, it can also be, on top of that, there's a social norm with regarding I in the community where it's played that you should conform to the rules of I. And again, the social norm could be specific to that game. It could be a general idea that it's jolly bad form to cheat. In the case of the rules that are constitutive norms, e.g. the constitutive norms of football, it's contingent whether or not these are also reinforced by the attitudes distinctive of a social norm. Because the sanctioning of rule violations is already provided for in the rules. If the referee detects a foul, then he awards a penalty to the other side, okay? It may or might, violations of the rules may or may not also be disapproved of by other players and by spectators, etc. So it may or may not be sanctioned by a social norm, okay? So just to recap my general conclusion from this. A rule can be both a constitutive rule of a type of activity and also a social norm governing its performance in a community. As with moral and social norms, the latter, as with moral norms and conventions, the social norm can reinforce conformity to the regularity that is the rule. That is, the force of a social norm reinforces conformity in its individual realizations in the community. For example, people will cheat less in games, even undetectably, if there's a strong social norm against cheating. Okay, so this is the very quick final bit, and I'm only just over time. So the things I've set out about, you can have a constitutive norm of activity, so it's, as it were, constitutive of that activity that to be engaging it, you have to be trying to conform to the norm, or at least you know that you ought to conform to the norm, but it's still contingent, the extent to which people actually conform to the norm, either because it's difficult to conform to, as with I stance, or because there are game-related motives to violate it, especially if not detected, as with various rules of games that constrain the permissible means to achieve the object of the game. Okay. So you can have something which is a constitutive norm in that sense, because it's contingent the extent to which the norms fulfill an actual playings of the game, or the activity more generally. You can also, consistently with that, have a social norm reinforcing conformity to that norm. So you can have the consistent, have the combination of something being constitutively a norm of the activity, but also a social norm reinforcing it. Okay, so what about assertion? And I'm just going to be very quick here. I'm just going to talk from this, actually. Oh, now hang on. Can you hear me? Can you hear me? Okay, so consider the generic idea that a certain speech act type, and I can, for the type I'm going to write assertion in capitals. Consider the idea that that type assertion has a certain constitutive norm, and represent that norm schematically as one must assert P only if S of P, where S is schematic for some specific condition, which is your favoured norm of assertion. So our present concern is with the question, how does this type of speech act, with its constitutive norm, relate to the possible existence of a social norm governing a practice in some community of making a certain kind of speech act in that community? So we have this question. What makes it the case that a particular abstract speech act type, assertion, with its distinctive constitutive norm, is indeed the speech act that's involved in a range of ongoing linguistic transactions in the practices of the community? And this is my answer, that a social norm exists in that community surrounding the practice that sanctions it with attitudes of approval of conformity and sanctioning disapproval, etc., of non-conformity, and that the regularity that's the subject of those sanctionings of a social norm is the very same regularity that's the core of the constitutive norm of the abstract type. In the case, let me just make it so, in the case of football, we could make sense of the rule being, as it were, involved in a particular playing of the game, even if there wasn't a social norm, because there are these explicit sanctions of violating within the rule book. So the referee will book you for a foul, and award a penalty to the other side, even if the spectators are not bothered about fouls. But in the case of assertion, we haven't got, as it were, the analogue of the referee. So it makes sense to think that a practice in a particular community is assertion only if and only if, I think, there is a social norm sanctioning assertions that violate the norm, which is the constitutive norm for that type. So that's my answer to the question, whether the general answer to the question, can something be both a social norm and a constitutive norm? I hope I've spelled out how. And in the case of assertion, I've said the abstract type, well, I have more to say on this, but supposing it's true that qua type of speech act, assertion is individuated by a constitutive norm, the constitutive norm individuates the type. What makes it be the case that that's the speech act that's going on in a certain community? Answer, there has to be a social norm sanctioning that very norm that's constitutive of the type. Okay, that's my thesis.